Hello, my name is Greg Alone. I'm a software engineer at Xojo and the primary developer on Web Framework 2.0. For those of you who don't already know, we are excited to tell you that we're quickly approaching a public pre-release for Web Framework 2.0, and we expect it to have in testers' hands very soon. We had four main goals when we're designing the next generation of the web framework: an HTTP 1.1 compliant server, minified frameworks and client rendering, and instead of creating our own based framework from scratch, we're now using jQuery and Bootstrap. All these new technologies mean that we needed to update our minimum target browser to the following versions. And since last year, we've updated our minimum Microsoft browser to Edge 12. Web 2.0 is bringing some exciting new technologies to the table, including browser history triggers, so you can store state information and tell when a user tries to navigate their browser by clicking the forward and back buttons. Saving state information is as easy as making some data and telling the framework to save it as a state. If your user presses the forward or back button, the session hashtag changed event fires and includes the saved data so you can restore the state. Server Connection Monitor keeps an eye on the server connection, and if things get unstable, the user will be shown a modal dialog with a customizable trouble message. And if the connection cannot be restored, a second customizable disconnect message is displayed. And an all-new tab order system, which more closely matches the desktop experience, featuring forward and backward focus wraparound. There are three new layout modes. Fixed, which is just like the classic web framework and the desktop. Controls stay where you put them. We also have fluid, so the controls can flow inside a view based on available space. And coming soon, auto, which uses a constraint-based system similar to iOS. Let's talk about controls. Here's a list of the visual controls that we have in Web Framework 1.0. And this is the list of controls in the first release of Web 2. So far, these are the controls that are working. Canvas and Map Viewer will get updated functionality later this year. Toolbar and List Box are still in progress for release with Web 2.0. And these 6 remaining controls have been deferred until a later release. Since we did a complete rewrite of the controls, we took the opportunity to expand their capabilities wherever we could. Here are some examples. File Uploader has been converted back to a basic uploader control. But the underlying engine will be available for Web SDK developers to hook into, which means it'll be easier for third-party developers to add custom uploader UI. Something we know you all have been waiting for, a new list box with pagination, dynamic data sources, draggable rows and columns, and custom column types with a publicly accessible column API through the new Web SDK. In a future release, the Canvas control will be enhanced with the capabilities of JCanvas. This gives us access to layers, events, and drag and drop right in the browser. We've built an all-new toolbar based on the Bootstrap navbar. And while not a control in of itself, Web Menu Item has been redesigned from the ground up to match the look and feel of your application. They will be theme compliant and support disabled items, icons, separators, headers, and even be hierarchical. They'll be used in pop-up menus, combo boxes, toolbar menu items, and contextual menus. Let's talk about styles. If you're using the classic web framework, then you know that styles are a little painful to use. This time we've decided to take a completely different approach. By default, all web apps will use the basic global Bootstrap theme. You'll be able to drop a custom theme file into your project and update every control in your project simultaneously. And of course, we've made it possible for you to preview this in the IDE. But that's not all. You'll still be able to selectively override styles in many cases. We have selective control level customization like text alignment, attributes, colors, and multi-line for labels. There's also property level style access so you can set individual properties in Xojo code. And if you're feeling adventurous, you can even type in raw CSS. So let's talk about project conversion. First of all, converting a project from an old IDE to Web 2.0 is a one-way process. All controls now use API 2 events, methods, and properties. And apps will build as standalone only. For those of you using Xojo Cloud, it's also getting some updates for Web 2.0. IDEs with Web 2.0 will build 64-bit standalone apps only. Older IDEs will continue to deploy 32-bit CGI apps. We will be designing an all-new control panel using Web 2.0. Each app will need to have its own domain or subdomain. And load balancing will be added in a future release. The Web SDK 2.0 is being enhanced for all these new features. Unfortunately, that means that Web SDK controls will also need to be updated. A modern version of jQuery and Bootstrap is on every browser. And we're not doing user agent parsing anymore. Modernizer will be run on every browser, so you can detect if the browser has all the features that your plugin needs. And although not required, we're encouraging everyone to use TypeScript for Xojo Web SDK development, and definition files will be made available to you for the SDK itself, list box column renderers, and the uploader engine. Here are some demonstration projects showing the new capabilities of Web Framework 2.0. For instance, for Web 2.0, the progress bar control became an animated SVG file because they're fairly small and require very little resources. This opened the door to letting users specify their own SVG files if they want a different look. We also found that because we'd opened styles to any CSS property, all kinds of things can be animated, including size and opacity. Here's an example project showing several of the basic controls using the basic Bootstrap theme. Here they are at runtime. You'll notice the progress bar actually has some animation on it, and you can turn that on and off if you want. Here's a progress wheel, and as I mentioned in the video earlier, this is an SVG file, so you can replace it with anything you want. Here's a pagination control that can be set up, a pop-up menu. Here's the date picker control. And you can set the start and end dates of this date picker. Here's the new tab panel control. And next to it, this is a page panel. If I click change, you can see it's changing the panels as I click. Here's an example of a project where we've taken we've set the cancel and the default properties on these two buttons so that they will fire when the return and escape buttons are pressed. So if I run this project, you can see if I press the escape button, or the escape key, it actually fires the pressed event for the cancel button, and if I press return, it triggers the OK's pressed event. Now I'm going to show you the brand new chart control. Get out. Now I'm going to configure this completely in code. First thing, we're going to do some configuration. So we're going to set the title and tell it has a legend and give it a background color and add the labels for the data points that we're going to add. Now charts can have three different kinds of data. There's a linear type for bar charts and line charts. There's a circular type for polar charts, and there's a scatter chart or a scatter type for scatter charts. So we're going to first add a data source for income. We're just going to use some random values between 50 and 100. If I run this, you can see we get a pretty chart. It's got rollovers that tell what the values are. These are actually clickable, so that and you can get events on the server. And you can overlay data sources onto one another. So if I run this with a second data source, this one's a line chart being drawn on top, and they're translucent, so you can have Here's a quick example of a change that we've made in terms of how listbox works. Let me pull out a listbox. Listbox will have a full preview once the framework is released, but we don't have one right now. But I'm going to have listbox add 10,000 rows. Now, if you did this in the current web framework, this would take a long time to get pushed down to the browser. But we're going to just run this. Now, what we're doing behind the scenes is we actually load the rows that you add into a data source on the server, an in-memory SQLite database, and the client will pull the data as needed down to the browser. Look at that, huh? And if I scroll, you can see when those blue lines come up, it's actually pulling down more data. And this list box only keeps about 100 rows on the browser at any given time. So even if I've scrolled down a little ways and then scroll back up, it's actually going and repulling the data. So the list box will always stay up to date with the data that's on the server. So if you were to do inserts or removals or whatever, the list box can have a data source now, so that it can load from a database or from another data source if you want to use that. Here's an example. I started converting the Eddie's Electronics web project into a Web 2.0 project. And you can see if I go to the web page, toolbar doesn't render yet. List boxes don't render yet, but here's what all the controls look like. Now they're a little bit larger than they were in Web 1.0, so your layouts will need a little bit of tweaking. If I run this, you'll get a chance to see it. Now one of the things that we've done for the new web framework is we added a new tab engine. So if I hit the tab key, and I'm just hitting tab here to focus, it's automatically going to the fields, and this is the tab order that I've set. And once we get down to the last control, it automatically wraps around and goes back to the beginning control. So we're not allowing the focus to actually leave the page like it did in previous versions. And I can click on users and load data. This is one of those dynamic list boxes. If I scroll down, you can see. Oops. And loading data is relatively quick. And of course, this is running locally on my computer, so it's really, really fast. Here's a list of some things that we've planned for future releases. Action stacks, a way to chain together and run common commands completely in the browser. Auto layout, a constraint-based page layout system to make it easier to adapt your web apps to different size screens. Drag and drop, a flexible system for defining legal drag and drop actions for your users. Remote font loading, a built-in mechanism for downloading custom fonts at runtime. Multiple layouts per page, being able to define multiple configurations of position and visibility of controls on a page so you have less logic duplication. A rich text editor to allow your end users to type rich text directly into their browsers. Visual data validation and formatting to make it easier to design foolproof forms which format and validate data completely within the browser. And visual session controls to allow you to attach controls directly to a session so you can easily add things like help desk and notification systems. And there's also some new things for Xojo Cloud coming, including an IDE latency simulator, a way to simulate the round-trip time it takes for a request to get to and return from your Xojo Cloud server to give you a more accurate local testing environment. Instance communication, to allow your load-balanced app instances to communicate with one another. And public key authentication. No more passwords for SFTP or tunneling into your Xojo Cloud servers. Now you'll be able to authorize your individual users simply by adding or removing their public keys from your server.